Hi, I intend this to be a follow-up to my previous video on my conlang Toki Kalama, which I submitted for the Cursed Conlang Circus, but I'll also be discussing many other things, so I wouldn't say that video is necessary, but it is what I'm following on from. I'm Milamba. I didn't actually say that in the last video, which is hilarious. But considering I have a bad memory, that's fine. So, Toki Kalama I created for the Cursed Conlang Circus because it wasn't meant as a serious attempt to make a musical conlang. If I was going to do that, it would be very different, but it was very fun nonetheless. The name Toki Kalama is, as some of you may know, Toki pona, and in Toki pona it means noise speech, which I think is accurate, because that's what it is. It's noise that apparently conveys meaning. Let's talk a bit about the premise of linking SOL-RE-SOL and MOS. So I think it is best to start off with what I meant by taxonomic in my previous video, because taxonomic is not the term for it. I cannot remember what it is, and I never can, so I call it taxonomic instead, in reference to like genealogy, like the way in which animals are categorized according to their kingdom, family, whatever the other ones are called. And that's where the word taxonomy comes from. But I will sometimes call it Dewey Decimal, because the Dewey Decimal System is similar. And especially when I'm going to explain it, it sounds awfully similar to the way that I explain how SOL-RE-SOL works and the way that my conlang works. The Dewey Decimal System uses the numbers 0, 2 through 9 and assigns them a value, specifically a semantic value that you put books in. The Dewey Decimal System is a system for sorting books. It's a product for its time, like SOL-RE-SOL. Look, the way that it categorizes religion, it's awful, but it's fine, because it isn't necessarily the only way to sort books. It does intend for every book to be able to be sorted via saying what its largest semantic category is, and then slowly adding more digits on until you get a whole book. And then there's generally agreed upon areas for books to be in. So there's going to be some examples here, because I can't think of any off the top of my head. I think 600 and something is computing. I know 170 something is either sociology or politics. So it kind of functions as a form of reference system. The way in which other conlangs function. When I said that there's lots of examples in my previous video, I mean that there's a lot of examples, because this was very fashionable for a time. So if you know Conlang Critic, you'll be familiar with some of these examples. So OWI intends to use 24 symbols, but for it to also be pronounceable, which is a goal which is not suitable for a cursed conlang, which is quite funny. So OWI uses 24 symbols, I think it's 24, and it combines them to create concepts. It intends to be universal by making it a small number, but really it makes it very vague, which is one of the reasons why I find these systems not actually that suitable for real-life communication. So OWI has 24 symbols. Rho has, I think, it's 16 possible letters. I may be off on that. But Rho is one of the early examples of a system where you slowly add on letters to create more specific words. I believe that Ido uses it. And then one example that I keep seeing pop up is Igaday, but I don't think that does use it. So maybe someone could explain that to me. I don't think it does use it. But anyway, all these systems have functionally a letter-by-letter meaning system, which is distinct from what Toki pona and MOS have. But I'm just going to keep going for a little bit on the kind of cultural use of this, because there are also kind of examples in popular media of systems where you have meaning assigned to specific symbols. That isn't to say a logographic system. That is different. So what I mean is, for instance, the Golden Compass / Northern Lights, if you're in anywhere else, by Philip Pullman, the alethiometer is a dial with 60 symbols, and through a combination of 3 of these symbols, you're meant to be able to form any question, which is impressive. Admittedly, it functions on a slightly more complicated level because you're meant to think the level of meaning that you're doing. But effectively, it's a 60-symbol way of conveying information. Obviously, that's a slightly larger inventory than Owie's 24, SOL-RE-SOL 7, mine with 12, but it functions under the same idea. I thought I had more examples, apparently I don't. So, with that real-world example to the side, you can start to understand where my linking of Toki, pona, and MOS come in, because the alethiometer has 60 symbols, which is only half as much as what Toki, pona has, and is similar in that the context of what each word is meant to mean in a Toki, pona phrase is kind of gotten through the accepted meaning. The alethiometer uses mental imagery, but the idea is that there is a set number of words that you convey a set amount of information in. So then Toki, pona, and MOS both have about 120 more words to convey information, and they accept broad semantic categories for each one, but that's no different to the way that SOL-RE-SOL and the Dewey Decimal System and so on and so forth use the broad categories under each one of their nemes, whether that be numbers or tones or morphemes. And so in a natural language, you just have, under this system, a long list of words, and it's not accepted as a small list. You just have a large inventory to try and convey the amount of information you wish to convey. You don't try and amalgamate it into anything. You don't try and reduce it because you want the nuance. And this is a problem I find in psychology. I study psychology, because in some research, like personality or emotions, they try and reduce all experience of such a thing to a set number of conditions. So with emotions, you might have a 6 emotion system as Ekman proposed, where you have happiness, sadness, excitement, surprise, anger, and disgust, I think is the 6. Or you might try and encompass it in 16, or however many you think is appropriate. But really, that's not a system that humans have. Humans are so diverse. It's the reason why we have language. Language is intended to solve the issue of needing to combine things. In all of these systems, to actually get anything complicated, you need to combine elements together. And sure, that's good for a cursed conlang, where the combinations of sounds or tones or the way that you combine it is amusing, versus in actuality, where you're trying to convey something sincerely and it starts raining in the middle of your video, which is probably not going to be great if that gets louder. Anyway, if you're trying to convey something sincerely, you don't want to have to convey it as a combination of disparate elements. Sure, that is the way that people amalgamate information, and it can be a way of sorting out a kind of logic to your new idea. It's a way of conveying it where someone else could understand the steps you went through. But when you're trying to convey an all-encompassing experience, it's very difficult to do that without just a word to convey it. Of course, this has been addressed in psychology. If we go back to the psychology examples, Lisa Feldman Barrett, I think is her name, If it's not, I'll put up the correction here. She says that language is the way that we process emotion, that emotions only exist through the use of language, that if there is a word for an emotion, then it exists, and not before. And this view is interesting, considering that with research into alexithymic people who struggle to identify the emotions that they feel and put words to it, it's clear that you don't need words for emotions to experience said emotions, but the philosophy behind it as a kind of you have a word per thing is the opposite end of the spectrum from all these kind of reductionist conlangs, such as Aoi, such as SOL-RE-SOL, etc., where you divide up things into the smallest possible categories and then build up your definitions again. On the opposite end of that, you have kind of the idea that for a concept to exist, it needs a totalizing word to describe it. And I think a good example of this would be last year's submission of the unglossable conlang, because that has a word per thing, and you can't really express it in any other way. And that's nice. In some respect, it's difficult, but it is nice. It's the other end of this idea. Of course, natural languages kind of fall on a variety of places across here. When you actually get down to, say, looking at etymologies of words, if you're the kind of person to look up etymologies, which if you're watching a video about a conlang, you probably are, when you read the etymology, it's like, oh, it comes from this Greek and this French and this German, etc. I mean, depending on where you are, you might have a different selection of languages you're pulling from. It's this Vietnamese, it's this Mandarin, it's this, etc. That kind of etymological breakdown tries to put the semantic meaning that Lisa Feldman Barrett talks about, the semantic collection that we have attributed to words, but breaks it down as if it wasn't, as if there were a set number of historical parts that you build up into words. It's an interesting way for science to work, and although I could go onto a sociological tangent on how science has failed us in the way that it tries to break down concepts and ideas and people into disparate categories that don't actually encompass the holistic experience that people actually are, I'm not going to. I'm going to save that for a different video because I want to try and stay on the conlang topic. So Moss and Toki Pona. Let's discuss them for a little bit, because now that I've set out this scale, we can kind of see that they take not a middling view, they are more towards let's create a small inventory and see where we can go from there to build up the ideas that people have. However, they also have something which other systems potentially don't when I call them taxonomic. Taxonomic systems have a reference list, effectively, which has a predetermined way of splitting up ideas. So, particularly with the Dewey Decimal example, if you were to take a book and try and analyze it by yourself, it just goes into wherever you say it goes. That won't line up with what someone else says. But that kind of listification, that's not the right word, that kind of systematization, that way of making it systematic where things go, reduces the fun, I guess, is the point. So, changing this from a random book to specifically Toki Pona, in Toki Pona, you get the freedom of what words to use. And although in the video I said about how there is a second book which outlines specific ways in which words have been defined, it is true. It's in the introduction. It says, that the first book serves as a snapshot and reference point of one key person's way of using Toki Pona at one key moment in time. This foundation is paired with the invitation on 62, now the rest depends on you, go enjoy yourself, create, play, and be pona. And I think that freedom of what you decide things semantically mean is more in line with a holistic vision of definitions than potentially some others are. When Toki Pona and Moss give people the freedom to create ideas, it isn't totally free. They have given a prescribed list of terms, which can be seen as a form of power that the creator has over those that speak their language. However, it is still better than other conlangs, like Ro, like Aoi, where there is more of a prescribed method. And I think that freedom is part of what makes them good for people. I think Jan Misali might have said in their video about Toki Pona that one of the reasons that they prefer it over some of the other conlangs is because of that freedom. I may be off on that, but if it is, I will have like a screenshot of when they say that. Because Toki Pona is fun to work out what you want to try and say. It's fun to work out how to say something. It's fun to have that freedom. And although vocabulary creation, as a part of the conlanging process, is often kind of terrifying and difficult, when you use a system where you have a set number of terms and you just have to kind of mash them together, that's fun. When you are trying to do it more of a natural language style and you just have a vocabulary list that consists of some different languages' ideas of what the key verbs, nouns, and adjectives are to describe things, it kind of puts onto you their semantic knowledge and their way of speaking. When you create your own inventory of words, you create the amount of silliness that you can have. It's more fun, it's more freeing, and in some senses, it's more cursed. So leading on from that, it kind of makes sense why I chose to just assign random values to this 12-tone scale that I invented. I didn't invent the 12-tone scale, I mean the fact that I'm using these jumps as a form of phoneme. They are arbitrary, but I wanted it to be that way. I wanted it to be a ridiculous system where you have to combine these very weird concepts together to try and create the meaning in the translation. And it was a bit daunting at first to think, oh, what do I need to put on here? But it's also part of the enjoyment that I found was saying, oh, it's kind of weird to describe Edward as a human in the third person conjugation, and then in the phrase later describe him as dead and not human. That's quite funny. And it's quite cursed. Why would the third person conjugation for Edward in particular, who is being described as a vampire, make him human? That kind of contradiction is very interesting in the fact that I chose to make it. And that's why I wanted there to be freedom in it, why there's no prescribed vocabulary list attached to my video. Because if you wanted to use this list of terms to do the same translation, you would probably come out with something different. Although I have a first-person conjugation and a third-person conjugation of tenses, it's not meant to be a set thing of what I say versus what he says. And even the first-person conjugation was a bit of a joke on my part. I said that the first person was the definite human, in a reference to Descartes, who said, I think therefore I am, meaning that I am the only definite human in existence. That isn't meant to be taken seriously. It's meant to be an offhanded reference that makes sense to me for it to be first person, but the freedom exists within my conlang for you to just reinvent what the first person conjugation is. That's what I find fun about what I've created here. You have the freedom, if you wish, to just remake this with your own 12 terms and do it your own way. Sure, I put some thought into what these terms were. I wanted an equal distribution of tense. Sure, those 4 tenses are a bit weird. Like, I have the conditional past, present, and future. Like, if you don't tense something, I'm pretty sure it's just present continuous. It might be declarative, honestly. But they kind of link into the concepts that I was trying to link them to, because the conditional tense is a proposition of potentiality. So it's not just that it's the conditional tense, it's that it's the tense linked in with the idea of something being possible. This is actually kind of similar to Toki Pona in some respects, because the way Toki Pona does tense is also with kind of prepositions. To say something is in the future, you say basically how we do it in English. We say going to do something, where going to is in fact a prepositional verb describing a relationship between a person and their future location. But we use it as an ability to do future tense. And not all languages have this, and some languages have it and another future tense. Spanish, for instance, has ver a, meaning to go to, as a form of future tense, but it also just has a future tense. So it's kind of interesting I distributed them equally. I tried to have semantically similar things equal distances from the tritone, where the tritone is again the negation, because all of these concepts also have their inverse, which you create by singing it and then the tritone either above or below it. Because I kind of wanted it to be semiotic pairs, but then that's like a really weird concept. And actually, here is a good point to discuss the idea that my friend came up with, which would have meant redesigning this, but it would have been a whole lot more cursed, because their idea was that you have 2 ideas, right? You have, say, life and death on a spectrum. Let's make that a spectrum, and because it's 2 tones, sure, they're a semitone apart, but it's 2 distinct hertz levels with just a slider in between, and then you can pick which tone you sing that at to mean the amount of living and the amount of dead a thing is. And as fun as that would be, it would mean redesigning the whole system to be like scales between different tones, and it's basically a different conlang at that point. As fun as that idea is, I decided not to run with it. Yeah, so my conlang has some other aspects to it which I suppose I didn't entirely lay out clearly, which upon further discussion with this friend, they are also a conlanger, kind of enumerated some things which may make it clearer what I mean. So when I say that the subject is conjugated under the verb, it's more so that the subject position is underneath the verb. It's more so a matter of positioning the subject as conjugated, because it's in that position. It's sung the same as the object, and the nuance of this means that if there was both an adverb and a subject, which is obviously bound to happen but didn't happen in this example, it means that they would both start on the same tone, and then you would sing out from there in different directions, depending on whether it's the adverb, which would go up, or the subject, which would go down. Which is kind of silly, kind of cursed, but we did get that example, so it's fine. I also did fail to mention that there is an absence of specific rhythmic indicators or specific stress indicators. In many other musical conlangs, those are the 2 other features that allow for differences in semantic meaning. Because I was trying to go for the ridiculously small inventory, building up a full word, I decided to just avoid any other features that may impact that. So I just didn't include rhythm as a consideration. I didn't include stress as a consideration. I certainly could have, and there is some indication that it is, in fact, in there, because I try and fit the phrase underneath the phrase that's being sung. That is to say, the subject needs to fit within the bar that the verb is in. However, that's not strict. Technically, you could have this with kind of an almost free conjugation order. So you have the main phrase, and as long as two phrases don't have the same average tone, you could put the conjugations of everything just kind of anywhere underneath, and because of the way that it works, you would be able to backwards work out where it's meant to be conjugating for, which is quite fun. Talking about the conjugation, the maths. This is going to be the maths portion of the video. You can skip this if you want. So, the maths isn't actually that complicated when you come down to it. Hertz, which is what we measure tones in, is a logarithmic scale, meaning that when you double the frequency, which is what Hertz is measuring, when you double the frequency from 440 to 880, you get the same note. So you have A440 and you have AA80. These differences are indicated by numbers, so A4 versus A5. But it does mean that the maths get slightly complicated if you want to create an average tone. So the way that you do this isn't what you were probably taught that the mean is in school. So when you were taught the mean in school, you were taught to add up all the numbers and then divide by the number of numbers that you have. That's what you were taught, because that's generally what the mean is. Because most scales are linear. This is the arithmetic mean, and it's great for stuff like that. However, when you have a logarithmic scale, and you want to create the mean in the same way that the arithmetic mean creates means, what you need to do instead is multiply all the terms together and take the root of those terms, where the n of the root is the number of terms that you are multiplying together. This is because, let's take a simple example. If you have 220 and 880, this should get you 440, because you are averaging out A's 2 octaves apart, so you want it to average out to the A in the middle. So you multiply 220 and 880 together, and then you square root it. To actually explain what this means, we could go into the logarithmic stuff and put it all log base 2, or log base 12 in this instance, I think would be better, and kind of work it out. But really all you need to understand is that I'm doing a logarithmic mean. However, this isn't how I calculated it, as I mentioned in the video. So, because of the way that I was writing out my conlang, because of the way I was writing out term by term, kind of saying, oh, what is the definition of this? It needs a second, a seventh, and a sixth, right? What I had wasn't a list of tones, but a list of jumps, because that's what this conlang is. But the list of jumps was kind of... it's not ideal for trying to create the average. So the way that you do it is through this formula. I hope I've managed to recreate it on screen. This formula, I'll explain. So 220 to the power of n is because when you multiply all of the terms together in just your average geometric mean, that is to say your standard geometric mean, what you actually have is a base tone, and then you can write out every other musical note in terms of that base tone and a distance from it. So 220 times 2 to the power of n over 12. Why is it n over 12? Because 12-tone equal temperament is calculated that way. 12-tone equal temperament being a scale of 12 tones which are all equal numbers of hertz apart, or not hertz apart. If you take the log base 12 of it, they are equal tones apart. It's basically the same reason why we have the geometric mean. If it was arithmetic, it would be equal spaces. Basically, taking the 12th root of 2 and then multiplying that because n over 12 is taking the n is taking the 12th root of 2 that many times, multiplying it together. Accept that this is the way that it works. So you have each of the 12, each term in your sequence, written out as 2 to the 20, 220 times 2 to the n over 12. However, these jumps don't refer to jumps from the base. They refer to jumps from the previous tone, meaning that you need to multiply each of these by the number of times it appears in the phrase, which is why you have 2 to the power of that mess over 12, because that mess is the way that you calculate the jumps, basically the final tone. The way that you actually do this in practice is that you take the list of tones, you then just do a cumulative frequency for it, and you just add up those in the top. But in actuality, this is the full formula. It's very fun. I find it fun. I'm guessing a lot of people who hate maths don't find it fun. But basically, this creates the geometric mean at the end, which is how I got it. But as I said in the video, I didn't use this. I used the one that was nearest to it, because I couldn't be bothered to work out the microtones for it. Yeah, it is kind of sad that I was I chickened out of singing it, but also, no thanks. I appreciate that this is a Curse Conlang contest, and you'd be fine with it sounding terrible, but also I kind of wanted to convey more so what it sounded like, and not what I sound like. A subtle distinction, I know, but one which I figure made the experience slightly more enjoyable. I think the outro is salvageable from the last video, but at the moment we have some builders around, so different day, when it's hopefully quieter. I want to talk for a bit about the evolution aspect to the conlang, because obviously I intended it to be a precursor to SOL-RE-SOL and MOS, so that it would fit into the category. It's not a priori. So that it would fit into the proto-language category, and so I want to talk about that for a bit. So the intention is to almost describe a society where they use music to communicate, and this is kind of the originator for lots of different musical conlangs, the two in particular in this instance being SOL-RE-SOL and MOS. As outlined earlier in the video, I kind of can see a way in which SOL-RE-SOL and MOS's philosophies aren't in fact in conflict, that they're just different places on a spectrum. And so I wanted a language that also utilised similar elements, so partially breaking down the tonal spectrum into distinct elements with semantically broad meanings, but also giving people the freedom to put that together however they want. In specific, I was trying to think about a way of doing this in a story, because originally this was going to be a story submission, but I decided against it. But I guess part of my reasoning does come from the hypothetical story that would have been told, so I might just relay some of that here. So originally, there was a society, and they had lots of different ideas about what a musical conlang would be. Many different ideas on what melody, what harmony, what rhythm and other such elements could mean. And so some people thought, hey, why don't we compromise on some of these elements? And so rather than using distinct tones, they used tone jumps. The harmony that you see comes from the averaging effect, and there's a variety of ways in which this conlang can be seen as a compromise between different ideas, but it also leaves out a lot, and so different groups within the people that made this language were like, hey, this isn't great. This doesn't satisfy our needs for language. And so one said, oh, I like the way that you broke it down, but I think that we could potentially break it down into more elements and potentially make it slightly more harmonizing if we used a 7-tone scale. We could also standardize some of these melodies into specific words. The common short tonal phrases in SOL-RE-SOL are words in themselves. And they also said that why should they use tonal jumps when they could just use the tones in themselves? They kind of wanted to simplify everything down. They wanted to standardize it to make it easier for people to learn, because the people in that group were more familiar with languages where you just have a list of words to learn. On the other hand, you have a group of people who saw the attempts at jumps and said, hey, why don't we turn these phrases, these jumps, we standardize them a bit, we make them melodies and give them meaning. We kind of broaden the semantic categories that we have access to. And over time, the semantic nature of individual tones was lost, and the overall semantic message of the melodies remained. Moss's melodic phrases that it uses to convey information were slowly listed out, and similar to Toki Pona, where the community adds phrases as they think it's necessary, so did Moss. They added new terms, they added new melodies. And they maintained some of the element of averaging, because in Moss's sentence structure, you slowly descend in tone as you go through a phrase. So if you wanted to say that I'm having 3 drinks of water, each subsequent word, obviously once you gloss it into that language, would slowly decrease in where the tone is meant to be, because there is no standardized tones or tonal jumps in Moss. It again keeps the freeing element that my conlang partially has, and really opens it up to individual interpretation. And on the flip side of this, SOL-RE-SOL maintains its 7 tones as standardized, and you have to use those 7. As I say, I want these to be 2 groups that had different ideas inspired by a single proto-language. It sounds silly because it could also be people from each of these communities making a language, but then that would make it a kind of a priori language. But the way that I see it is that there were several attempts at creating languages that used music, and then people were like, nah, these ideas are terrible. That the attempts, which is my language, were bad, and so people were inspired to make better languages effectively. Not to say that they were perfect, but that they were certainly a better achievement. Moss's evolution continued down a path of freedom of semantic knowledge and freedom of tones, whereas SOL-RE-SOL maintained a kind of standardized feel to it. It standardized the meaning, it standardized the small elements of the language. And I think this comes back to the ideas that I was discussing earlier in the video about the power the creator has over the speakers of said language in the way that they give words. So in SOL-RE-SOL, they prescribe the words, but they also set out a method to create new words via the association that it has between its tones and meaning. But it is a kind of, as I described, taxonomic, and so the standardizing method by which that occurs, I wanted to keep in my conlang, because they had to be inspired by it somewhere, and that's why I kind of try and stay consistent in the words I'm using in my translation. I try and use the same definition over and over again. So you describe Edward as a vampire, the next time Edward comes up, you use vampire to describe him. And then Moss, and its continuing freedom of definition, I think would eventually evolve past the idea of any set number of terms and kind of open itself up to more interpretation. Kind of like how I think it's Viosa, and I know there's been some other experimentations where people don't use their native languages, they try and create a language collaboratively. That is kind of the vibe I get from Moss. And so I don't want my language to be prescriptive in that way, but also I do. I very much want it to be, because then that's how SOL-RE-SOL came about. It's a very prescribed way of making words that was disagreed with by the Moss community, and so they split off. It's a very weird way of kind of analysing a language, saying that hypothetically these two things could have come from it. Especially when it's musical conlangs, when you actually have some more natural language influence there, it kind of makes sense when you construct a language this way, because you at least have phonemic possibilities with the way that sounds evolve. But when you have tones, you kind of have to do more philosophizing. You have to kind of imply that the way people felt about how language was communicated had a disagreement in it. It's interesting. Maybe it's not the best way to construct a language, but I think that it works in this instance because it's meant to be a cursed conlang. It's not meant to be the final solution. It's meant to have different ideas come out of it. I think I'm going to use my outro from yesterday that I filmed. I think that's usable. So I'm going to hand you over to the me from the past, and I mean, if I have anything more to say, I'll just film another section and add it on here. I don't think there's much more which I want to say in this video. I just kind of wanted to go into more depth into my thought processes and kind of the ideas that went into the conlang. I hope you enjoyed this kind of rambling style with many tangents, because this is probably how I come across. It's not... This is how I talk. It's very random, very all over the place, eventually coming back to the same point over and over again, that this is a cursed conlang that I made. I am very confused at the way YouTube is acting with the video. I don't know how YouTube works, which is by design, but it's very strange. Maybe I should ask you to like and subscribe. Maybe I shouldn't. I actually don't know whether that matters or not. Plus, I may or may not make more cursed content. Probably next year, but in between that, I might do more sociological or psychological stuff, because that's actually more my wheelhouse. I'll see what happens, really. Again, uni is coming up quick, and I don't really mind, but I do need to make sure that I don't fall behind on uni compared to the enjoyment of making videos, because it is quite enjoyable. It's also quite fun editing them, adding in all the corrections, because I make so many mistakes. I do hope you enjoyed. I may or may not see you in a hypothetical next one, because I don't know what is gonna happen in the future. Bye.